So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about international migration. And I added this other point here about simulation of a US point system in terms of immigration policy. I already mentioned that I will talk about the proposed southern border wall, which pretty much studies have been showing that this wall would not work and would not and would just cost a lot of money, but it would not be able to block undocumented immigrants to come from the southern border. And there's some more discussion about it there. And the current federal administration has been thinking about implementing an immigration policy system that would be similar to the Canadian system, in which they would try to focus more or give higher chances for immigrants with higher educational attainment to enter the US. And what some studies have been showing is that that can increase the proportion of immigrants who are highly educated who do enter the US. But as a whole, as the whole labor market in the US, that kind of policy would not increase the educational attainment of the whole population. Exactly because children of immigrants, the second generation immigrants, they tend to improve their education levels and get into the same levels as the US born population. So I added these slides there. This is an article that just came out now in 2020. And I include the reference at the end of this lecture here. And right here, that's the paper by Van Hook and others, Immigration Selection and Education Composition in the US Labor Force. And I also include a link that summarizes that article as well in the slides related to this topic. So in the last class, we came up into this graph here that actually have been discussing this topic since the lecture about theories of migration and specifically about international migration. So countries that have higher levels of economic development, they tend to attract more immigrants. So immigration levels, they increase as the level of development increases. And on the other hand, countries that have really low levels of development, when the population is really poor, they don't have the means to actually move to another country to find better job opportunities. So the levels of immigration of people getting out of those countries is low. But as these countries start to develop, and those people, like when they enter more like low middle class and middle class, they start to have more economic means to move away. And they also get to know about other job opportunities and places to move. And the chances to emigrate, to get out from their own countries, increase. But as their countries start to develop even more, these people will start to find job opportunities and better living conditions in the places where they live. So the chances of getting out, of emigrating, declines, right? So the immigration curve has an inverse U shape association with development, and immigration is pretty much always an increasing association with development, okay? Hey, Sophia, thank you for sharing the GroupMe link on the chat. And just to give you an idea, in 2013, based on data from the UN, more than 50% of the international migrants in the world resided only in these 10 countries here. So in 2013, out of all international migrants in the world, 50% of them were in these countries. And in absolute numbers, in millions, 46 million of them were in the US, 11 million in Russia, 10 million in Germany, and so on. Just to show that most of the international migrants nowadays are concentrated in the US. And here it's another graph, not in our textbook, but from another textbook about the major origins and destinations of international migrants. The previous graph is about the stock. In 2013, right now, after all these previous years of people moving from different countries to different countries, how many now live in the countries listed here? So that's the stock of international immigrants in those countries. And if we take into account that some countries, they receive immigrants, but then also people from there born in those countries, they move away and they go out to other countries, another way to analyze it is to net migration. And this data here is in the thousands. So we are pretty much counting how many people moved between 2010 and 2015 to the US minus the total number of people that left the US between 2010 and 2015. And this difference, it's around 1 million people, right? So 1 million people, they left more the US if you subtract the number of people that, 1 million people entered more the US if you subtract the number of people that left the US. So the countries with a positive net migration are the ones on the top, and these countries here are the ones who lost more people than received. So number of immigrants minus the number of immigrants, it's negative. In Syria, exactly this period here involves the civil war that's going on now in Syria. They lost 720,000 more people than they gained immigrants, right? And the flow in Syria has been more to outside, trying to get away from the civil war. And related to the first graph that I showed, this is the stock of immigrants, so people born outside of those countries, and what's the percentage of them living out of the American population? What's the percentage of the people here living in the US were born in other countries? That's the stock, because again, we are not just looking for migration between 2012 and 2013. Throughout the whole history, a lot of people entered the US, and right now, what's the percentage of the American population that's foreign born? So it's more than 10%. And the countries with at least 10% are the dark red, between 1 and 9.9 is the orange, and countries with less than 1% in yellow. And now I'm going to talk a little about the patterns of the world immigration over time. And then afterwards, I'm going to go into the specific case of the US. So the first modern humans began in sub-Saharan Africa about 195,000 years ago. And by 35,000 years ago, humans were found everywhere at the opposite ends of Eurasia, from France to Southeast Asia, and even Australia. So in between these years here, all these humans, they migrated from sub-Saharan Africa to all over the world. And how modern humans went about colonizing these and other drastically different environments during this 160,000 years in between these times here is one of the greatest untold stories in the history of humankind. Of course, we don't have data from that time, and it's hard to understand. So there are a lot of theories about it, but it's not really clear how people moved and spread all over the world. But of course, that was also related to all this migration process. Also, a lot of people died throughout these movements. So about 50 to 60,000 years ago, humans began to migrate out of Africa. So they started there in 195,000 years ago. And then between 50 and 60,000 years ago, they start to move first to Southern Asia, China, Java, and later to Europe. Then they began migrating to the Americas around 14,000 years ago. So by 35,000, they were in these places. And then even after that, around 14,000 years ago, they start migrating to the Americas. And the movements were often through land areas and short sea routes, which was possible to move with the means of transportation that they had at that time. After first migrants, population flows to a new territory were usually preceded by an invasion of armies. So migration started to be related to army invasion through wars. An example could be found in the raiding activities by the Scandinavian pirates, like the Norse or Vikings, in England, Ireland, and France between 800 and 1066 AD. So all these movements that started to happen after that, they start to be more related to one population, one group of people trying to move to another place, trying to invade them, and usually exactly through war. International migrations, invasions could also involve the enslavement and forced migration of the defeated peoples to the land of the conquerors. And for example, during the 5th century BC, Athens had about 75,000 to 150,000 slaves from both Africa and Asia. And they represented 25 to 35% of the Athens population. So it was a considerable amount in percentage terms as well, right? So these absolute numbers here might not mean a lot if you compare to the population size nowadays, but taking into account the population size at that time, that was a considerable percentage share of the population. After the 14th century, international migrations and invasions became more transoceanic. So exactly because of more advanced methods of transportation, it was possible to move to more far away areas. So all this territorial exploration led by large naval expeditions played a role in the dynamics of human migration to other parts of the world. And European immigrants as a share of the world population increased from 3% in 1750 to 16% in 1930, exactly because a lot of these naval expeditions were exactly being done by European countries such as Spain, Portugal, France, and the United Kingdom. The largest period of European overseas migration happened between 1840 and 1930. 52 million people immigrated primarily here to North America. And also before World War II, intercontinental migration from Asia was smaller in scale, but still you already had some movements of people across the world. Asian Indians immigrated to British Guiana, East Africa, Fiji, Mauritius, and Trinidad. Japanese and Filipino migrants moved to Hawaii. Japanese moved to Brazil. Like slavery in Brazil ended in 1888. And then after that, the federal government tried to bring people from other countries in order to work in coffee plantations and agriculture. And the Japanese people was one of them, those that the federal government in Brazil tried to bring them. There's like a lot of like history books talking about this, how they were treated really badly there and everything, really poor conditions. They were exploited a lot. And of course, there are several studies being done for all these different movements here. And Chinese also came to the US to work in the development of railroad and infrastructure in the country. The largest intercontinental slave migration in recorded human history happened between 1650 and 1800. Around 9.6 million enslaved Africans were brought to the American continent, talking here about everything, North America, Central America, and South America. And if we count those who died during the sea trips, the sea voyages, like it was around 11 million Africans, they were taken into the ships between all these years here. And exactly because this migration here were like a large number of people being forced to migrate from Africa to the American continent, it had a lot of consequences. So it had consequences in terms of the geographic redistribution of the global population. So now you start to have a bigger population in the American continent. It created pressures of the population on land and resources. Pressures of the population on land and resources in the old world in Europe were relieved because now you have fewer population in Europe, exactly because they're moving into the American continent. And birth and death rates were delayed in European countries with large immigration, while birth rates were high in the destination countries in Americas. And again, whenever I'm talking about the term America here, I'm talking about the whole continent, not just the United States. The geographic distribution of race has also changed dramatically across the world. By 1930, about 1/3 of all whites no longer lived in Europe, exactly because they start to move to other countries, other continents. And more than 1/5 of all blacks no longer lived in Africa, exactly because of the forced migration, the enslavement, because of slavery. Since the 1930s, there have been several major international migration movements, most migrants being refugees and asylum seekers. So even nowadays we see the Syrian civil war is the one that we always refer because there are a lot of like refugees and asylum seekers living Syria, Afghanistan as well. They were involved in wars against the Soviet Union and more recently with the United States. A lot of them leave Afghanistan, and even in Central America, from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, there has been more recent, a lot of immigrants trying to come to the US as refugees, trying to get away from violence from their home countries. And large numbers of Jews and political refugees fled Germany during the World War II. 20 million Eastern and Central Europeans were uprooted from their homelands between Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s and the end of World War II. So World War II caused a lot of movement, international movement in the world. And when the war ended, about 3 million Japanese were returned by decree to Japan from other Asian nations, right? So during the war, a lot of people moved between countries, and then also after the war, a lot of people moved back to their home countries, and that's the case of these 3 million Japanese people. All the migrations in the 40s, after the partitioning of India in 1947 into India and Pakistan, more than 7 million Muslims fled from India to Pakistan, and a comparable number of Hindus moved from Pakistan to India. And in 1948, thousands of Palestinians were displaced from the territory that is now the country of Israel. So this is just to show that all these dynamics, international migrations, they have been happening for centuries, for several years, and they are really important, even in the way that the world is composed right now by different people. In the 1970s, millions of Southeast Asians were uprooted owing to political and economic disruption. So this resulted in one of the largest and most tragic refugees migrations in history. 10 million refugees migrated from what had been the East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and they went to northern India. So really related to that tension that still exists between Pakistan and India. Even nowadays, there's like a lot of like political tension between them. Subsequently, millions of Asians escaped from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, going to Thailand and other countries. In Afghanistan, as I mentioned before, because of all these different conflicts with different countries, it has a lot of refugees, people getting out of of Afghanistan because of all these wars. The 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan generated massive numbers of refugees. There were about 6.5 million Afghan refugees between 1988 and 91. Another 5 million refugees left Afghanistan from early 1990s to 2000. So by the early 2000s, about 1 in 4 Afghans were refugees. That's 25% of the population of Afghanistan. By the early 2000s, they were living in other countries as refugees, exactly trying to get out of all these different conflicts going on in their country. And more recently, the modern refugee era began at the end of the Cold War, around 1991, with the end of the Soviet Union, and then with also the collapse of the Eastern European communist regimes. Many developing countries were still engaged in violent conflicts after losing support from their superpower backers. So a lot of developing countries that depended on the Soviet Union, they started to have a lot of wars, and like with the division of the former Yugoslavia, that we had the war, and that caused a lot of people, even in the 90s, to move to all different countries. So there were a lot of people moving from Eastern Europe, trying to get out of these conflicts and going to Western Europe. So a lot of the conflicts going on in Bosnia, the Bosnian War, and so on, and in Serbia, a lot of people tried to move from these countries, going to Scandinavia, for example. In mid-90s, I was an exchange student during high school in Denmark, and there were a lot of refugees in Denmark trying to get out of the Bosnian War that was going on at that time. Around 2001, there were 3.6 million Afghans found in Pakistan and Iran. So exactly because Afghanistan had all the wars and the conflicts with the Soviet Union. And in 2003, several million refugees fled Iraq due to the invasion by the US. In Afghanistan right now, after 9/11, after the US invaded Afghanistan, then the refugee issue from Afghanistan, it's still a process that's going on in the country. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is the agency within the UN that estimates the number of refugees all over the world. And they estimated that there were around 46 million refugees in the world. Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan sent out the largest numbers of refugees. Syria really related to the civil war that's going on right now in Afghanistan after 9/11, and the US in the war with Afghanistan. A lot of people tried to get out from there because of the war that was going on. Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Turkey, and Jordan are the countries receiving the largest numbers. Syria is sending a lot of refugees to Turkey. Most of them go to Turkey, but also considerable numbers go to Jordan, Lebanon, and northern Iraq, not Iran. Okay. But Iran is also receiving refugees from other countries, not necessarily from Syria. That's my point here. Syria is sending mostly to Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and northern Iraq. And if you look at the websites from the UNHCR, and if you just Google UNHCR, Syria civil war, you're going to see interesting articles and graphs showing where these immigrants are going. You can even look at this now. So here, UNHCR, Syria, civil war. Let me just see which one is going to be. There is one paper, like This one is already open. This one here, I think. Yeah, so this is data that I don't know if I don't think I showed you before. It's data that has been updated really often. So this is data from October 14. 5.5 million Syrians already left Syria because of the civil war. Around 3.6 million, or 65% of the refugees going to Turkey, 16% to Lebanon, 12% to Jordan, and 4.4% to Iraq. So just showing all these trends here. So here pretty much just, this is the link on the chat if you want to check it out. I just Googled UNHCR Syria Civil War data on refugees, right? This is the website that I was mentioning. The next topic on this lecture about international migration is about the trends and the levels of immigration to the US specifically. So it's focusing on the case of the US. Like almost 99% of US residents are either immigrants or descendant of immigrants. So they are either first, second, or third generation, third plus generation. In 2010, about 1.5% did not self-identify as immigrants or descendant of immigrants. And these were mostly American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. So even the white population, they self-classify based on the 2010 census as descendant of immigrants, most of them. So this 1.5 would be considered as non-immigrants, really the native population. Immigrants of other countries are mostly migrant workers and rarely become citizens. So when we compare the case of the US, of these immigrants and descendants of immigrants, to what's going on in other countries, the reality is different. For example, the United Arab Emirates, 84% of the population right now there is foreign born. It's like first generation, like foreign born are now living in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates. And those migrants have restricted rights, they rarely become permanent immigrants, and they are, and that's not the case in the US. In the US, immigrants, like second generation immigrants, they already consider Americans because they were born here, and even first generation immigrants, they have a chance to become permanent immigrants, permanent residents, either through green card or citizenship. The US receives most immigrants of all the countries in the world, around 46 million. And 14% of the US population is foreign born, or composed by people born in other countries. And this fraction is smaller than other countries, such as this 84% of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia as well. And in those countries, most of these immigrants are male immigrants going to work in the oil industry in those countries. Right? This is a graph showing the number of immigrants and immigrants as percentage of the US population between 1850 and 2013. I mean, I think here's only until 2012. And the columns here are the absolute numbers in millions in the vertical axis on the left. So it increased until 1930 and then declined again. And then after 1965, there was a huge increase in the number of immigrants. So it's around now 40 million people. But these numbers have been more stable in more recent years. In terms of percentage share, it declined. And then after 1965, you start to, and we're going to discuss more why after 1965, it started to increase again, okay? So it's now around 13% of the American population. And this red line here, the vertical axis is this one on the right, shows the percentage of the total population that's foreign born. And this is pretty much the same the same information, but like just showing a different way. The number of foreign-born population in the US between 1860 and 2010, it increased over time. It has been like around 40 million in more recent years. And the percentage, the light blue line here, it declined and then increased after like in the 70s and so on, and it's around 13% as we saw in the previous graph as well. And of course, the country of birth of immigrants changed over time. The character of the US immigration has changed since the mid-1800s. The origin locations of immigrants to the US have changed dramatically. In 1960, 75% of the US foreign-born, they were born in Europe. In 2010, only 12% of the foreign-born population in the US was born in Europe. So it dropped from 75% to 12% between 1960 to 2010. And this graph here, this table here, summarizes these trends. So these are overall numbers, absolute numbers of immigrants to the US between these years. So increasing a lot over time. But then when you look at the region of origin of them, until the late 1800s, most of them were from Northwestern Europe and also from South and Eastern Europe. And then in more recent years, you start to see an increase of immigrants coming from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. You see an increase in Africa, but still these numbers here are not comparable to immigrants coming from Asia and from Latin America. And immigrants coming from Latin America surpass those coming from Southeast Europe and Northwestern Europe by the 1960s, right? So 791,000 coming from Latin America between 1960 and 69. And these numbers also started to increase a lot from immigrants from Asia. What, like Dudley Poston, the author of the textbook that we use in this lecture, is saying that most Latin American immigrants now, the net migration, for example, between Mexico and the US has been pretty much zero. The same number of Mexicans coming from Mexico to the US equals the number of immigrants coming from the US back to Mexico. So net migration equals zero. And a lot of the unskilled immigrants coming to the US right now, of course, a lot of them are from Latin America, but a considerable amount are coming from Asia. So the hypothesis from Dudley Poston, the author of our textbook, is that these immigrants here will replace the unskilled immigrants from Latin America in the American labor market, right? So that's his hypothesis that we'll be able to measure in this coming decades. And here is the percentage of the foreign-born population in the US. It increased during the time that a lot of immigrants were coming from Europe, but then it declined in the beginning of the 1900s and increased again, reaching around 13% that we have right now. And this is just to show in absolute numbers, in millions, the number of immigrants that were the foreign-born population in the US between 1960 and 2010, how the overall numbers declined from Europe, and now has been stable since the 90s. But from Latin America and the Caribbean, from Asia, has been increasing. I mean, from Latin America, you see that this area of the curve here is much wider now, but even from Asia as well. From other areas, it's not so, the increase is not so considerable in absolute numbers when you compare to those immigrants born in Asia or Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the annual number of legal US immigrants by decade, 1960, 70, 80, 90, and 2000, and region of origin. Back in 1960, 39% of all legal US immigrants, they were coming from Latin America, 11% from Asia, 49% from Europe and Canada, and 1% from other countries, a total of around 321,000 immigrants, legal immigrants in this case. And the percentage of Latin Americans coming to the US with a visa increased over time and then declined in the 2000s. But this is to show that they increased a lot over time, percentage share of the legal number of immigrants. Also, the percentage share of Asian immigrants increased a lot. And those from Europe and Canada declined and have been more stable, around 16 and 15%. Right? This link here it was organized by the Migration Policy Institute. If you just go to this page, organized by the Migration Policy Institute, you can just select whatever country you want on this drop-down menu here. And here in this series of graphs that I just mentioned into this link, and I collect this data, and this is data that they used, data that they got it from the Census Bureau, and they just put it in their website in these easy to generate graphs. In all this series of graphs that I'm going to show you now here, I always select Mexico, just because the way that this tool works by the Migration Policy Institute, the vertical axis here change depending on the size of the flows of people moving, of the immigrant population by country in all these years. So I'm always selecting Mexico here to serve as a comparison, but also to have the same vertical axis that we can compare across these slides. And a lot of this discussion that has been done about immigrants come from Central America to the US, they come exactly from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, northern Central America, and they have been increasing in more recent years. And a lot of these immigrants are children moving to the US without their parents, so it creates a huge challenge to how to deal with that population. So there are several organizations, NGOs trying to deal with it, and the government, the current government has been really abrupt with those children and putting them in concentration camps in the south of the country, and also separating them from their families when they come with their families. And the overall number of Mexican immigrants, like foreign-born population in the US by 2017 is still high. The net migration of recent flows is close to zero between Mexico and the US. But because you had this long history of immigration from Mexico to the US, the immigrant population right now in the US that was born in Mexico, it's around 11.5 million, right? But of course, these people here might have arrived in the country several years ago, okay? And the next graph here, I'm showing immigration from China and India, just to show how immigrants from these Asian countries have been increasing in more recent decades. The next one, I'm showing from Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom, exactly to show how immigration from these European and countries in Canada have been actually really small and declining over time. I just selected countries that to better understand the dynamics that we saw in that table, that we saw the origins of immigrants, and then I selected specific countries. You can select all different countries in this website. And here, looking at immigration from African countries, and in this case here, I chose Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, because these are West African countries that their first language is English. And I was just doing a research looking about how immigrants from Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone are doing in the US, exactly because technically their integration, it's easier to be done because they already know English. And I did some studies with another professor from the sociology department, Dr. Sakamoto. But at the end, we kind of like know that the origins of these immigrants, the realities of these immigrants is completely different. The ones usually from Liberia and Sierra Leone have much lower socioeconomic status compared to the ones from Nigeria. So we are focusing the analysis on Nigerian immigrants. And I have some presentations that I have done about this research that are available in my website as well. I mean, I can show this stuff because sometimes I think it's just interesting to show. I think you might have seen in my website here, I have the papers that are already published and drafts. This paper exactly about Nigerian Americans, I had it available in the Open Science Framework, but we submitted for publication now, and the journal asked us to take it out from the public domain. I just like to make things more public. But if you come to presentations, then you have some slides here that I present in several different conferences. And if you just you just search for Nigeria, these are slides that I presented exactly about this, how children of immigrants that came from Nigeria, they are doing in the US. And that's the work that I'm doing with Dr. Sakamoto and 2 students. So that's and here, like in this graph, we see these really high increases, but when you compare these increases with the population born in Mexico, it's still really, really small, right? But that's just to show that even in this population here, that in absolute numbers, it's small compared to Mexican immigrants. We can learn a lot about these dynamics. And if you want to read about it, it's all related here. And this is just to show that immigrants from, in this case, we just focus on Nigerians. Nigerian immigrants that are children of Nigerians, second generation Nigerians, both men and women, they have much higher chances of have higher education compared to the third generation whites. So for example, here, second generation Nigerians, those that are children of Nigerian immigrants, among the men, they are 3 times more likely to have higher education attainment than the third plus generation whites. And among women, it's even higher, 5.3 times more likely to have higher education attainment than the third plus generation whites. Cool? This should show, like, just selecting one country, you can do a lot of studies. And that research I'm doing using data from the current population survey. This is the foreign-born population by country of birth, again, to show that Mexico is much higher than in other countries, exactly related to this graphs that I showed before. The Mexican immigrants, the ones born in Mexico, they are pretty much 29% of all foreign-born population in the US, based on data from 2010. And from China, 2.2 million, so 5%, and so on. Immigration has a major effect on the size, distribution, and composition of the US population. And since we know after the demographic transition that fertility and mortality are actually relatively low in the US, so fertility below replacement level as an average here in the US, and mortality with really low levels as well, you had increases of deaths in the US related to drug overdose, and now the pandemic, and there are several studies trying to understand the effects of the pandemic on life expectancy here in the US. So you have some increases in mortality, but still the overall levels of mortality in the US is low. Exactly because the fertility and mortality levels are low, the immigration's role in the growth of the population has increased in these last decades. Immigration contributed to around 30% of the total population increase between 1980 and 2000. The number of foreign-born US residents rose from 14 million to 36 million between 1980 and 2005. And here is to show exactly those numbers, like 14 million, the foreign-born population increased from 1980 to 36 million in 2005. So that's an increase of 40% from 1980 to 1990, and 55% from 1990 to 2000. So increase in a really rapid pace, faster than the US-born population, because the US-born population, the increase is more related to fertility in relation to mortality. And here we have immigration itself. So the foreign-born share of the increase in the size of the population has been around 30% compared to the 69% of US-born population. So still, these people here are growing in absolute numbers, but still most of the increase in population size in the US is still due to increases in the US-born population, right? These guys here increasing in size, have been a really rapid percentage increase, but the share of the overall increase in the country, because 253 million is much higher than 36 million, most of the increase has been related to the US-born population. Here's the foreign-born population by state as a percentage of the state population, showing that California, Nevada, Texas, Florida, New York has really high, at least 15% of the population is foreign-born, right? In more Midwest and the southern states here have lower percentages. This is the percentage growth in the foreign-born population. These states here overall have really high numbers of immigrants, people born in other countries living in these states. So that's why they have these higher percentages. But exactly because these states here have lower numbers, if you change a little bit the number of foreign-born population in these states, the percentage growth in the foreign-born population is higher exactly in those states in which overall you have lower percentage of foreign-born population in those states, right? But because they are low, between 2000 and 2005, if you increase a little bit the number of foreign-born people in those states, it represented a lot of the percentage growth of the populations in those places. This is the migration flow from 2003 to 2012, the number of legal immigrants flowing to each state between 2003 and 2012, exactly the same, usually places receiving more immigrants. And this is the migration stock. After all these decades, these years of migration, was the percentage of population that's foreign-born in 2012. In the previous one, we are talking about the flow between 2003 and 2012. What's the number of immigrants going into those specific states? Here is the number of immigrants in 2012 in those states. And this information is shown in percentage terms. And I talked to you before about this majority-minority discussion that we have in the US. This report here is a report that was funded by the National Academies of Science. It was published in 2016. Waters and Pino are the two organizers, coordinators of this report, but it was all this research doing that report has 500 pages, and the information about it, it's in the references here, and you can download that report from the website. Census Bureau projections point to continued increases in foreign-born population in the next decades. By 2060, the foreign-born proportion will reach nearly 20% of the population. Non-Hispanic whites will have fallen to less than 50% of the population. So if you put all minority groups together, all non-Hispanic, all those people that are not non-Hispanic whites together, they will be more than 50% of the population. So all minority groups together will form the majority. But this term, majority-minority population, is really controversial because a lot of these people that are being counted as minorities, I mean, they have so many different people included there. You have the Hispanic population, the non-Hispanic African American. You also have the American Indians population, and you have also those people that self-classified as two or more races. So even if someone self-classified as being white and Asian, that person is included here as minority. Or white and African American, that person is included as minority. And some of these groups, I just showed you the case of African Americans in the US here, the cases of Nigeria. In that specific group, within African Americans, those are second generation immigrants, children of immigrants. They are doing much better in terms of education, even compared to the white population. So these groups that are putting them all together as minority groups and saying that they are going to be more than 50% of the population, it's really, really, really heterogeneous group, right? So whenever we're talking about this majority-minority concept, it's important for us that we are putting together a lot of people as minority groups and saying that they will be more than 50% of the American population these next decades. But this group vary a lot within them. So you have the American natives, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, and so on. And those people are really different from each other. An estimated 11 million persons, about 25% of the current foreign-born total, are undocumented. And annual deportations from this group have approached or exceeded around 400,000 people. So that's information per year. And here's the US population by race and ethnic group. So in 1970, 83% of the population was non-Hispanic white, and then declined to 63 and to 52. Depending on different demographers, their projections, the year exactly in which all these other groups here will be more than 50% varies from these different projections, but it's expected to be around 2060, that the non-Hispanic white population will be less than 50% of the country. This is more interesting for us to talk about, not that all these groups here are similar to each other, the Black population, the Hispanic, the Asian, and so on. It's more that we are increasing diversity in the country. There is a book by Diversity Explosion by William Frey, a demographer from the Brookings Institute, and he talks exactly about that. And he does his analysis for smaller areas in the US using census data and the American Community Survey. Many migrants from Mexico and Central America enter the US with low education levels and little English proficiency. But their children, the children of these foreign-born immigrants, are seen to have converged substantially to the native-born average in broad array of domains. So usually, immigrants on average have lower levels of education than the US-born population, but the children of immigrants, the second generation of immigrants, the ones that are born in the US, their education, earnings, occupation, poverty, residential integration, and language characteristics tend to be more similar to the US-born population. So it's showing that these people are integrating into the culture, improving education, earnings, improving occupation, declining poverty, and integrating more into the society. And also, since they were born here, they know English. However, and also like the first generation immigrants, of course, I'm first generation immigrant too, but there is a higher percent of first generation immigrants that don't speak English very well. However, integration also produced declines in well-being. Remember the health Hispanic paradox? That if you compare the mortality and health indicators of the Hispanic population, most of those that are born in another country foreign-born Hispanic population and you compare their health outcomes to the US-born population, they have better health outcomes, even though they have lower socioeconomic status. So there is a health Hispanic paradox that we discussed in the previous chapter. When the children of these Hispanic immigrants, they are born in the US, they start to adapt into the American society in terms of what they eat and how they work out and all these different habits. And that has been affecting in a negative way their health, crime, and family stability. So for second generation immigrants, their health is worse on average than first generation immigrants. Second generation immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than the first generation immigrants. Those people born outside that come to the US, they are less likely to commit crimes than people born in the US. And people that are born outside, they usually have more stable families, right? So my children in the future, they will have, because they're born in the US, they will have more chances of committing crime than I had in my life. That's one example. That's what I'm talking about here. The integration with native-born, non-Hispanic white population tend to be faster for Asian immigrants, slower for Latino immigrants, the slowest for Black immigrants, and especially difficult for undocumented individuals because undocumented individuals cannot access a series of public services and benefits from the American government in terms of health, Social Security, and so on. Although they pay taxes, they cannot use some of the benefits from the government. This is the US-born and recently arrived foreign-born Americans by education, showing that overall the US-born population has higher percentage of those with high school degree or some college compared to the foreign-born population. And the foreign-born population, yes, has higher percentage of people with less than high school. But what those simulations that I include in the end of the chapter is going to show is that if you implement a policy in the US that try to bring people with higher levels of education from other countries, yeah, so you're going to increase this percentage here, but overall, that's not going to change as much the distribution of the American population by education, because this group here in absolute numbers that as we saw before, is much bigger than the foreign-born population. It's pretty much this stable here. This number here is much higher in absolute numbers. So even if you increase this percentage of the foreign-born population with higher education, that's not going to change the overall education distribution of this population. And this is the language spoken at home by the US foreign-born population in 2005. Most of them English, Spanish, 46%, English only, other Indo-European languages, and Asian and Pacific Island languages, right? Just before we go to the next topic, I just wanted to show the Waters and Pinot is this one here, the integration of immigrants into American society. This was funded by the National Academies of Science. That's this, and this one is a Windows, it's not a Mac, so I use the wrong key here. Control V. Is this one. You can download this book for free, and it's like over 500 pages, right? But it's just, and you have information about immigrant integration by various topics, by education, labor market, language, culture, and so on, right? The other thing that I wanted to talk, I talked about mortality. The Population Association of America, so if you just go populationassociation.org, is the main demography association in the country, the PAA, Population Association of America. And if you see here, upcoming PAA events, there is this mortality impact of COVID-19. Exactly, demographers discussing how the life expectancy could reduce because of the COVID-19 that's going on right now. I saw this just after our last class. I wanted to share that with you. It's going to be on November 19th, and you can register here for free. You just have to pre-register and enter the meeting, right? So it's just interesting that a lot of demographers are doing this analysis. And remember, in our course website, and this under, like at the bottom, about the COVID-19 pandemic, resources about demography and COVID-19. Population Europe has this website that they're compiling a series of studies related to the pandemic. And it's not just about mortality, but also about immigration, about like all different topics, how it's affecting, how it varies by age and gender and so on. So all this data is out there. The next topic on this lecture is related to the proposed southern border wall. So we discussed before, and these are like some short articles that were published recently by Dudley Poston, the author of the textbook. 44 million foreign-born people were counted in the US in 2018. Out of these 44 million foreign-born people in the US, 10.7 million were undocumented immigrants. And 4.5 million are visa overstayers. Let me just see something here. Where did I discuss the... No, wait, I jumped. Sorry, I jumped. I was on slide, I was like, wow, I'm missing one slide here. 54, that's where we're looking at the language. Yeah, the next topic now is about undocumented immigration. International migrants are often categorized as either being documented or undocumented. And undocumented immigrants are also usually called unauthorized immigrants. Unauthorized immigrants are those who immigrated into the host country through irregular or extra-legal channels. And there are two types of unauthorized immigrants. The ones that entered without inspection, the ones here in the US called EWIs. So during the process of migrating to the host country, the person avoided inspection by crossing borders clandestinely or travel with fraudulent documents. So these people really have fraudulent documents, or they cross, for example, the southern border without passing through the proper channels in the US. So these are the unauthorized immigrants that are coming through, for example, the southern border, the ones that enter without inspection. And among unauthorized immigrants, we also have the visa overstayers or visa overstays. This is the case of migrants who overstay the time limit of a legally obtained non-immigrant temporary visa. So usually these immigrants are those who enter the US with a tourist visa, and they stay in the US longer than what they are allowed to stay with their visa. Or those could be tourist visa, those could be student visa, and so on, all different visas that people just overstay the time that they are legally allowed to stay. So you have these two different groups. And based on previous studies that I have already mentioned here to you, millions of foreigners enter the US each day. 14.5 million immigrants were accepted as permanent, legal, documented US residents between 1990 and 2005, which is an average of almost 1 million per year. And the recent waves of immigrants have brought greater diversity to the US, exactly related to that discussion that I just had now about the majority-minority. I also mentioned Europe was the source of most immigrants throughout our history, and most immigrants now come from Latin America and Asia. And undocumented immigration began to increase in the 1970s. So if you look at this graph of documented immigration to the US between 1820 and 2005, you see different immigration phases. This one called here the frontier expansion, that most immigrants were coming from Northern and Western Europe. Industrialization phase in the US, most immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration pause, that the levels of immigration really declined a lot. And most of those that were still coming were from Western Europe. And the post-1965 immigration, though most are coming from Asia and Latin America. And this IRCA was the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, under which 2.7 million undocumented foreign US residents obtained legal immigration status. So that's why it increased a lot here, exactly because of this act from the IRCA in 1986. But you also see an increase in the number, the absolute number, and these numbers here in thousands of immigrants coming to the US after 1965. And, these numbers here in thousands, right here. I was just looking for this information. So here we have, like right now, around 1 million immigrants coming to the US. This data from 2005 as documented immigrants, right? And we're gonna talk about like this increase here in the number of immigrants coming to the US after 1965, which is really related to these different policies that started to be more open to immigrants, and also the fact that the US blocked some of the programs that would allow immigrants to come to the US temporarily. And that's what I'm going to discuss now. The Bracero program. The Bracero program is a major policy, immigration policy that shaped how immigration is in the US right now. It was a temporary labor program that admitted short-term foreign workers in the country. It was created in 1942. It was expanded in the second half of the 1950s, and was terminated in 1968. And exactly after the end of the Bracero program, in this program, what would happen would be Latin Americans and mostly Mexican immigrants would come to the US, work here temporarily as short-term workers, and they would go back to Mexico. And they would come by themselves, male workers, and go back to Mexico. Undocumented immigration increased after this period. So you have a program that you are letting immigrants from Mexico to come, work temporarily, and go back to their home country. And then in 1968, you terminate this program. Those social networks and all the demand of these low-skilled immigrants by the American labor market still exist. So the policy was implemented without taking into account all this process of the American economy needing this population. So these immigrants kept coming, not because there was a surge of undocumented immigrants, because now after the end of the Bracero program, these immigrants could not come with temporary papers, right? So there was not an unexpected surge in immigration from Mexico, but it's just because these low-skilled immigrants could not use temporary visas anymore. The end of this labor program and limitations on the number of available permanent resident visas made it impossible to accommodate the previously established inflows of migration. And when I'm talking about previously established inflows of migration, it's not that just I know people who live in the US and I want to go there and live there. It's because also the American labor market requires these immigrants to work in these low-skilled jobs that Americans usually don't want to work on. So the annual number of migrants coming with temporary visas was high until around 1965, but then the Brasileiro program was terminated, and then these visas were not implemented anymore, right? It increased a little bit in the 80s and 90s, but much lower than it was before. And the same people that entered the US with temporary visas, now they started entering without any documents. So they were undocumented immigrants. And in 1965, that's where also they have the hemispheric quota imposed, trying to impose the number, a specific number of immigrants that would get visas to enter the US legally. And when you impose these quotas and you break down, you terminate a temporary labor program, the number of undocumented immigrants starts to increase a lot. So the number of undocumented immigrants in the US is a response to a policy from 1965. A policy that closed the Brasileiro program and had a lot of limitations on the number of available permanent residence visas, right? And the country quotas were imposed after in the 1976, 77. And then in the 1986, as I mentioned before, in 1986, the IRCA was introduced. This act was introduced in 1986 in the US, and a lot of immigrants that were undocumented, they received permanent visas, and this dropped exactly because of this act, and now it has been more stable over time, right? So the increase in undocumented immigrants, it's really related to the fact that the labor market, the American labor market, still is looking for workers with those levels of education and skills, but they cannot enter the US as temporary immigrants anymore. The unauthorized immigrant population in the US increased from 1990 to 2007, but has been more stable over time right now, around 11 million people. And this is the unauthorized immigrant population in the US from Mexico. It also increased until 2007, but has been declining over time in these more recent years. And these graphs here are from the textbook. And one important thing here, this is foreigners entering the US or gaining residency status between 2003 and 2005. So these are absolute numbers in thousands. A number of immigrants coming with as legal immigrants, or temporary immigrants, like those that come here for as tourists with tourist visa, as students, or with their families, as children of people who are coming here to study, and the unauthorized foreigners. So this data is from different sources here. But what we see is the number of unauthorized immigrants has not varied a lot over time. I mean, this is data from 2003 to 2005, but even in more recent years, that has not been increasing a lot. And the whole discussion about the southern border is about these immigrants. But what the data is showing us is that most of the people who are unauthorized right now in the US are the ones that overstay their visas, are the ones that come as temporary migrants, but then they overstay their visas, exactly those people here. But the US does not have a system to track those people that enter as tourists and stay longer. So the whole emphasis is being done about these people here, but the visa overstayers are being the people who generate the higher numbers of undocumented immigrants in the US. This is the status of the US born population in the US in 2005. 39% were permanent or temporary residents, 31% naturalized US citizens, and 30% unauthorized immigrants, right? So the whole discussion that we are going to talk here now on Thursday is that a lot of the policies that we discuss, we have been hearing in the media by politicians right now, it's not based on science, it's not based on data. It's all just related to ideology and political beliefs. So the main idea about the southern border wall is that it's not going to work based on historical evidence, because most of these unauthorized immigrants are visa overstayers. They're not the EWIs. They're not the ones that are entering without inspection. And since there is selectivity of migration, those that are healthier and better able to come to the country, they will keep coming. We're going to see also the crime rates of immigrants are lower compared to the US born population and compared to the children of immigrants. The other topic about economic effects of immigration, pretty much saying that these immigrants, low-skilled immigrants, do not hurt the labor outcomes, wages, and employment of the US-born population. And we discussed these graphs here in detail. And then finally, the simulation of the US point system, saying that introducing this system in the US will not increase the education attainment of the US population as a whole. Right? All this discussion about international migration has been really controversial in the country, but if you look at all these different studies and data in science related to the consequence of a southern border wall, about the economic effects of immigration on the US-born population, and simulation of how we could change the US immigration policy, when you look at this, everything that's being suggested by the current federal administration, it's not based on data, it's not based on science, okay? And we're gonna talk about this on Thursday. So thank you very much. And yeah, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Thanks.